features to include within the Sasquatch tracks. I took the step of naming the footprints on the basis of ichnotaxonomy. Phil was stumbling over that kind of obscure word, ichnology. Ichnology is the study of tracks and traces. And ichnotaxonomy is a classification scheme to put labels on these tracks and traces where we don't really know what made the track or trace. You know, fossilized footprints in sediments that haven't preserved bones, but lots of footprints or burrows or dens. And so the name, the scientific name that's now published, it's out there in the literature, established literature, is Anthropoidopes borealis, which is a mouthful, but it's Anthropoidopes, that's the 8 foot of North America, borealis. So North American 8 footprint. And the type specimen are the right and left of the Patterson film site track. The casts, the molds of which, of the originals, are accessioned in the Smithsonian, in the Department of Anthropology. And then the referred materials are the 10 tracks cast by Bob Titmus, which are, the originals of which are accessioned in the Willow Creek China Flats Museum in Willow Creek. And 3D scans of these 10 are on archive in the Idaho Museum of Natural History. All right, we mentioned about the mid-tarsal break. I've explained that a little bit already, so I won't do it anymore, belabor it anymore. You can actually, the benefit of that, and the benefit of using these specimens as the type and referred material, is that we have, in this case, most likely, even though it's not recognized as such, we have the track maker. And we can actually look at what was going on to produce those tracks. You can see the mid-tarsal break. Now notice as the heel comes up, notice in that second frame, there's where that much of the heel is visible, and it is vertical. It's vertical. If that foot were a human-like, stiff, arched foot, then that means that the foot would be sticking 6 inches into the ground. But it's not. It's just flexed. It's bent there. What's also interesting, this corroborates my reconstruction of the skeleton. Notice the toes on that lead foot. So that foot swings forward and they dorsiflex upward, as they should. Not a static carved wooden foot or a pair of floppy Kmart slippers, as Bob Hieronymus described his costume. Those are long toes. Now, you know, Rene was kind of confused. Rene DeHinden had in his mind, and one of the reasons he dismissed all the stuff from the blues, which often exhibited fairly long appearing toes, he thought that all the toes were short and stubby, because this individual has a sole pad that extends well up under the toes on the foot. That's what creates that mid-tarsal flexion crease. My ex-wife hates me telling this story, but she's my ex-wife, so who cares? She has very flexible toes, long flexible toes, which she bends. When she was watching TV or something and wasn't thinking or sitting at the table barefooted, she could actually curl her toes under, and it looks like 2 fists. It's like if she was a kangaroo, she could just really, you know. But when you looked at her foot from the bottom, she was a very petite woman, but she had these chunky-looking feet with a very substantial sole pad. She could walk out across the pavement and strewn gravel. You know, they sand our hillside because it's quite steep. Our roadside, that is, in the winter, it gets a lot of grit and gravel, and then it melts. And you know, I could never venture out barefoot to our mailbox because I would hobble. I've got real tender feet, it seems. She'd walk out without even flinching. But I was doing my husbandly duty one evening as we were watching a movie, and I was giving her a foot massage, and it occurred to me, and I thought, and I took her toes and I bent them down like this. And well, the reason her toes look very stubby, her sole pad looks chunky and her toes look stubby, her sole pad comes way up far under the toes, almost to that last joint. And when I pushed down on her foot, boom, a crease threw up right across the end of her foot. Now, if you go home and look at your birth certificate, if you have an ink-stamped footprint, you'll discover that you were born with a crease across the ball of your foot, just like you have across your hand. But as your foot developed and as you began to walk, and that soft tissue and adipose and connective tissue, trabecula, and that matrix to hold it all in place elaborated, that crease gets obliterated. It's stretched back out. But in her case, so just transiently, if you bent, a crease would fold or pop up right across there. So here are those long toes. You know, when I reconstructed the skeleton, you wouldn't have thought that the toe goes clear back to that crease. And that view perfectly demonstrates that proportionality. Those are big long toes pointed up. And a prosthetic, carved wooden prosthetic, certainly doesn't dorsiflex its toes by any means. Now this is a cool example to also illustrate. You know, I talked a little bit about the pronation, supination effect on the axes of the foot, the forefoot and the hind foot. Remember I said Cliff Barrickman, after finding Bigfoot, spent just an obligatory 15 minutes saying hello in my laboratory for their episode of Pocatello. Cliff came back and spent the whole afternoon going through the drawers in my lab, pulling out casts and comparing them. He laid these two side by side. He said, Jeff, these are the same individuals, right? And I looked at that and I thought, well, you know, actually I've never considered that. And he said, well, look at their toes. And I said, well, yes, but look at the angle of the toes. And I thought, well, you know, if you turn this, because that's a pretty distinctive big toe, and if you turn this so that the toes line up, that's also a pretty distinctive fifth toe, this long splayed out toe. And someone had a cast that we took a picture of with the thumbs up, and this was the one I was referring to. If you compare her cast, that little toe looks remarkably similar. In her case, the toes are quite splayed out. Very similar to a cast of the same individual. I've got probably a dozen instances of this individual showing up in the Blue Mountains. But anyway, now the toes line up, and in fact the forefoot lines up perfectly. This front half of the foot, these superimpose just fine. The only difference is the angle now of the heel. Well, imagine your hand is a foot. If you externally rotate your knee, you'll notice if you do it even just sitting there, if you point your knee outward, it lifts up the inside edge of your foot. That's called supination. I tell my students to remember it because you go like this with your forearm. This movement is supination of the arm because you put your hand in this position to hold a handful of soup. Right? So supination, it raises that up, but when it does that, just as I'm kind of bending my hand that way, it changes the axes, the orientation of the axes of the forefoot and the hind foot. When you pronate, and you turn your knee inward, that pushes the inside edge of the foot down, that lines up those axes. So here, in this case, there's no suggestion of a raised medial edge. The axes actually line up perfectly straight. In this case, what some have interpreted as a human-like arch is just a raised medial edge, which agrees with the angles struck by the axis of the forefoot and the hind foot. And the intersection point of those axes is exactly where we predict the position of the mid-tarsal joint. This was cool. I mean, this was really quite a revelation, a realization to me. This is a prime example. I mean, there's nobody else out there, honestly. There's a half a dozen people in the United States who could walk you through what I just explained to you, that are thinking about it. Because you don't think about that in terms of human foot function, really. There's just a few physical anthropologists who are preoccupied enough with the human foot. And so for a hoaxer to have come up with that, to have devised these 2 feet and introduced just that variation in just that anatomically correct way. Now we show it, and this just illustrates in a human the degree of variation that you can see. It's not as marked as, because the arch, we don't have a completely stiff foot. There still is some mobility, but our foot screws into a stiffer position during the step so that the foot forms that stable platform. But here the foot is in a supinated position. More of the weight is on the outside edge of the foot. You can see how the outside is more curved. The medial, in this case the arch, is raised. You got that button hook. But in this case, they've driven it down with heavier weight and kind of internal rotation of the knee so that now the outside edge of the foot is much straighter and the axes are lined up more in line with one another. And the foot has a much flatter appearance. Okay, and we talked about this already. Another example. All right, now, if you have the luxury, it's always unfortunate when you think you have a footprint, but there's nothing in front or behind it. You know, the context is huge. If you can demonstrate a series of footfalls to place your mark, your impression, whatever it is, in context, you can build a much better case for it. An isolated track just doesn't have as much value because you're open to interpretation. So what do you do when you have the luxury of a long line of tracks? Well, carry along with you a longer tape, or you can do this with just a piece of cordage if you want to string out. But ideally, if you have a 50-foot tape, string it along adjacent to the tracks. Now, not always will your tracks be going in a straight line. Print out a set of numbers. Again, just cheap things that they can get wet, they can get dirty. Or if you want to laminate them, if you're going to keep them together in a kit. All right, and then have a smaller tape measure, or it's either steel tape or fabric tape. And then what you want to do is put your numbers down next to each footprint. Number them sequentially. And then you want to take a photograph of each, just like we've done here, of each footprint where you can see where it falls along your 50-foot tape and then how much displaced it is. Basically what you're trying to do is you're choosing, and usually, shooting for the most proximal point on the convexity of the heel, a tangent to the heel. And you're establishing an XY coordinate. Because it's really difficult to try to document a trackway in its entirety. But if you do it piecemeal like this, you have all the information you need to recreate a map of the foot pathway, the trackway at home. You have your XY coordinates, and you have your individual photographs that you can trace or project or cut and paste in the computer. The key determinants, not determinants, but the key parameters of gait include step length, which is usually measured as a projected length between 2 points on right or contralateral right and left footprints, left and right footprints. And then a stride, remember, is actually 2 steps. A stride is the distance from one point to that same point on the next impact of that same foot, that ipsilateral foot. The straddle is the distance between 2 footprints, and it's measured differently by different people. I've here advocated that you take a line that runs through your XY coordinate, and you're taking the measure between that. Some people who measure, say, the straddle, and you're measuring the footfalls of a quadruped, will take the greatest width that encompasses all of the marks left by those 4 feet. So as long as you're consistent, and as long as you're clear in your definitions. And then the angle of gait. Now remember that many people argue that Sasquatch has almost no straddle, that they walk like they're walking down a tightrope. There does seem to be some tendency for that, but not always, not always. And that's not necessarily in itself a critical feature, determining diagnostic feature. The angle of gait then is how pigeon-toed or how toed out are they? What's the angle of the long axis of the foot, usually measured through the 3rd digit with the direction to the direction of travel. And that's kind of an instantaneous direction because it's going to change if it's meandering or wandering. Okay, how do you make a footprint cast? What materials do you use? Well, you want to kind of assemble a kit so you're prepared. And there's two different strategies. You can have a kit, a lightweight kit that you use when you're out backpacking, or something that you keep in the back of your trunk or your truck bed. And here's a list. And I won't go through the whole thing. But what are some tricks? A lot of times if you find tracks, even if they're subtle tracks, subtle impressions, you can do things to improve your quality of your documentation. And one of those is to have some cheap hairspray, like Aquanet. The more lacquery it is, the better. Or you can put it to something like varnish or whatever in a spritz bottle. Some people prefer that rather than carrying a small aerosol can. But now they've got these little purse-sized hairspray cans, and it's great to carry. And you want to just mist it. Now, some of those have a fair amount of air force coming out, forces air, and you don't want to blow your dusty print away. So you want to mist that and let it float down and do several successive layers. Okay? Then, especially if it's a very shallow imprint, you still can make a good cast of it if you create a retaining wall. And I recommend you do this. Most of the classic casts you see look like this. But there's a lot more information in a footprint where there's been a wall created and you allow the plaster to flow over onto the surface of the ground. Then you have a record, a true record of what the real depth is and the nature of that substrate. You can make this, you can make these out of louvers from a Venetian blind, some people I've seen used. You can save your Clorox bleach bottles and just cut 2-inch strips, and then you can make it any size you want just by using some paper clips to clip them together. Okay, you can use that same Clorox bleach bottle as your mixing container, and you mix water and material. Now, some people use hydrocal, some people use ultracal. I don't recommend real plaster of Paris because it doesn't set up, it keeps a chalky finish and it will wear down, rub off on everything. Hydrocal and dental stone in general is great, but if you're like me, we don't have a source, an outlet in Pocatello. I had to go clear to Salt Lake City to the...
I bought dental stone there.
In Pocatello? Where?
Up on, Clark is the one that goes up towards the freeway, right?
Yeah.
It's either 13th or 14th in the street.
Yeah.
There's a dental place there that makes casts.
Oh, okay. Well,
And I
yeah.
stopped in there and I bought 10 pounds of dental stone.
And they sold it to you. Okay.
And then they threw in some of the real, more powerful
Okay.
yellow.
Yeah.
They threw in some of that for me, because they say the Forest Service comes in there all the time getting the
Oh, all right. For casting. Okay.
But it's up in that area off of Clark.
Okay. Well, there's no retail. They're ordering it in. So yeah, that's I never thought of asking them. They would sell it. Okay. There you go. Well, yeah. Well, then you pay just as much again for shipping, though.
Well, $10 is not bad.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. All right. Well, there you go. Learn something. Another alternate, and this has some advantages, is Fix-It-All, which is a patching compound. You get it in the paint department of a store. It has, in contrast to dental stone, which sets up very glassy. You know, you ping a cast made with dental stone and it sounds like China. Ping, ping. This stuff has a fiber content, and so it has a little bit of strength, little ductile strength. You tap on it and it has a thunk, thunk. I've had a student knock, Paul Freeman, all of his casts were made with Fix-It-All. And I've had a student bump one of his originals off a lab bench and see it bounce on the floor and not break. Whereas dental stone would into lots of stone. I mean, it's not indestructible, not indestructible. Those are, the longer it cures, the harder they are. Anyway, you mix that up, and then there's some art to mixing it. You obviously don't want to introduce a lot of bubbles into it, a lot of air into it. You don't want to whip it. You just want to carefully mix it, and then pour it in and let it set up sufficiently. Maybe scratch in the details of the time and the place and the date and so forth. Take it out, wrap it up in newspaper. It's going to be green for quite a while, and it'll take a while for the moisture to leave, for it to set up and cure. Now here's an interesting alternative that you should Pardon?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please.
If you come across a tract that is in leaf litter or pine needles or whatever, is it in your best interest to clear all that out, or
No.
do you?
No, yeah, you really shouldn't. You should minimize and resist the temptation to mess around with it. If it's in, I mean, one strategy that has been used, and I've never had that problem or that situation, be much more of an issue here. I've seen it done, is to take a sheet of saran wrap and lay it over the imprint lightly, and then put the plaster in on top of the saran wrap. Then it will, the weight of it will hopefully fill the impression, but it won't go down in between. I mean, if you try to, you know, sometimes you can see a footprint on a gravel bar, on a stream bed, for example. You can see the impression. If the gravel is coarse and you pour the plaster in, it just runs down in between, and you pick up and you just have a big thick layer of cemented gravel, and you don't have any essence, any sense of the contact surface whatsoever. But if you lay this saran wrap, now sometimes you get wrinkles and you get folds and they introduce artifacts, but at least you have you have an approximate shape of the appendage that left the impression.
Jeff, what about like a dry film silicone? Because on contact, it makes a dry, it's like a release agent. And if you sprayed it on, I would presume, because it would work on material, because they use it in the fabric industry,
Right.
you would think it would just, the plaster or the ultracal wouldn't stick to it, and it when you pull it up, the litter should just fall off.
Well, but it's not so much it's sticking to it as it is it working its way in between in the